Hi, welcome back everybody to our ongoing Lenten text study of Luke's Gospel, chapter 4. And I am very happy to be back with you after being gone for a week. By now you should know the routine, and I'm not going to rehearse that with you, but if you do have any questions, you can call us here at St. Mark or contact us. And just a very happy welcome to all of you who are joining from St. Mark, from New Hope, and others who have decided to join us online. You can see where we've been, where we're going. Today will be the last reading from the 4th chapter of Luke. Because after today's study and this week's study, then next week we're going to start looking ahead to the story of the entry into Jerusalem. Because we'll be preparing ourselves for Palm Sunday. And then the week after that, we'll be looking at the resurrection story. Even though we'll be in the middle of Holy Week, we're basing our text on the forthcoming weekend readings during worship. So this will be the last one from the Gospel of Luke's 4th chapter. And we're going to read most of the remainder of the chapter, not the last couple of verses. So let's get on with the text here. And today's reading is very brief. After leaving the synagogue, Jesus entered Simon's house. Now Simon's mother-in-law was suffering from a high fever, and they asked him about her. Then he stood over her and rebuked the fever, and it left her. Immediately she got up and began to serve them. As the sun was setting, all those who had any who were sick with various kinds of diseases were brought to him, and he laid his hands on each of them and cured them. Demons also came out of many, shouting, "You are the Son of God." But he rebuked them and would not allow them to speak, because they knew that he was the Messiah. Okay, so because today's reading is so brief, I mean just basically 4 verses, instead of doing a verse by verse, we're going to look at what I want to call points of interest in this story, and I think I have 5 of them in total. We'll see as I go down the list here. First of all, Simon Peter has a mother-in-law. Let's talk about that. Secondly, Jesus rebukes, not just once, but twice in this story. Let's talk about what that means. Thirdly, Jesus lays his hands on the sick. I want to look at that for a moment. Fourth, of course, there's that moment when the demons know that Jesus is the Christ and declare him to be the Son of God. And we see that Jesus silences them. That's an interesting thing. So these are the things that I want to lift up to talk about in our presentation today. On Wednesday, we can follow up on any of these 5 things, or you can bring your own questions, and we'll deal with that when we get there, okay? So let's go to the first thing. Simon Peter has a mother-in-law. First thing I want to say to this is a real opportunity to get snarky about priestly celibacy in the Roman Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church considers Simon Peter to be the first pope, and he's not celibate. He has a mother-in-law. So if you want to make jokes, go for it. I had I think it was a college professor who said he would tell his Roman Catholic friends, you should have had Paul as your first pope, because he seemed to have been celibate. Whatever. But the second thing I want to think about is what I want to call the hidden lives of the disciples. So a couple of years ago, I was reading not a biography, but it was about a biography, about a 19th century politician. And it said that biography was 280 pages long, very detailed about the politician's life and work and so forth. Not once did that biography happen to mention that he was married and had children. So, obviously, written by a man, about a man, for a bunch of men, and focusing on manly things, focusing on specific political things, focusing on international things, seeming not concerned at all about his personal and familial life. And in some respects, I think we get that with the Gospels. I don't want to say that critically. I don't want to say that in a way that, just a bunch of men writing about men for men with regard to the Gospels. But I do want to note that they're very detailed and very specific in what the Gospels are trying to talk about. They're not there to give you the full picture of everything you want to know about Jesus. They're not there to give you the full picture of everything you want to know about the disciples. We would not know that Simon had a mother-in-law if it weren't for this story. Thanks to this story, we know that Simon had a mother-in-law. We don't know whether he had children, but we know he had a spouse. But it raises a lot of questions. Look at all the disciples. Did they have spouses? We don't know. We hear that James and John were siblings. We hear that their father was Zebedee because they were in the boat with him. But we don't hear about families in a large extent. And frankly, we don't know whether Jesus had extended family beyond his brothers, sisters, mother, and Joseph, who's mentioned early on, but not later. The Gospels just are not interested in going there. And that's neither a criticism of them, nor is it necessarily room for us to do a bunch of imaginative work. There's just no there. We don't know about the backstories, the private lives. So there's a lot about the disciples, and frankly, a lot about Jesus that we don't know from the Gospels. That's why it's very important to let each Gospel writer tell the story they're telling, and not to try to make them tell the story we want. There's a little bit of difference there, and part of the discipline, I believe, in reading the Scriptures and letting the Scriptures state their own truth is not imposing a set of things that we need to know, but rather letting the Scriptures themselves determine their agenda. So that's an interesting thing, right? We get a glimpse of the fact that Simon Peter had a mother-in-law, therefore Simon Peter had a spouse, but we don't go on to hear his spouse's name, whether she's still alive, whether they have children. That's really none of our business so far as the Gospel writers seem to be concerned in these stories. So it's just an interesting thing to remember. Now, when they get there and she's down with a fever, it's interesting. Luke says that they asked Jesus about her. Not that they asked Jesus to heal her, but they asked Jesus about her. And we don't know precisely what that means, whether they were asking, is this fatal, is it not? Why they would ask Jesus that, if he was in the habit of diagnosing people's illnesses as being fatal or not. They just asked Jesus about her. And maybe that's a polite way of saying they asked Jesus to attend to her. And Jesus does so. And he does so by rebuking the fever. Okay? We're going to circle back to that word rebuke in just a minute and think about what that means. But for now, I did want to point out that the phrase for fever, translated as a great fever or a high fever typically, is pyros, from which we get pyromaniac and so forth, or the Spanish term puros, which is one way of talking about a burning piece of wood or a cigar or something like that. It means burning, something fiery. And magna, which is, for us, magnified. So this is a big burning going on inside of Simon's mother-in-law's body. An interesting way of just describing a very, very high fever. But when we say high fever, I think we're medicalizing it. And I want to suggest that maybe there are other ways of thinking about this magnified burning going on in her body. I'm not saying it should be a metaphor for something else. I'm just saying look at how it's treated. Jesus rebukes the fever. That's what we want to look at in a moment. But this story ends when Simon's mother-in-law is healed, and next thing you know, she gets up and serves them. And that's a bothersome thing for a lot of people, because it just seems like she's suddenly thrown back into being a domesticated woman. She is a Jewish mother, and there is a lot about serving people that is a way of asserting power and identity. It's most likely she's the matriarch of the home. So anyway, that's how the story ends, and that's not the ending that a lot of people particularly like, but it is how that part of the story ends. So Simon Peter has a mother-in-law. This is an interesting part of the story. Another interesting part of the story related to that is that how Jesus rebukes, because again, he's going to do it twice in this story. And the two rebukes here are, he rebukes a fever first, and later Jesus rebukes demons. I looked around the Gospel of Luke at the use of this term rebuke, and it appears 10 different times, 6 of them referring to Jesus. Here they are. In chapter 4, Jesus rebukes a fever. Later, he rebukes a demon. In chapter 8, Jesus rebukes the wind during a storm at sea. Chapter 9, Jesus rebukes the disciples. When they call him the Messiah, he rebukes them and tells them not to tell anybody. Later in chapter 9, Jesus rebukes another unclean spirit. Later in chapter 9, Jesus rebukes James and John. Now, Jesus had tried to get some overnight accommodations in Samaria, and he was turned away from a town there because he was heading toward Jerusalem. And James and John were mad and wanted to call down fire from heaven to consume that city, and Jesus rebuked them, and they went on their way. So rebuking happens in a variety of directions. In the 17th chapter, Jesus says, if a disciple sins, then you're to rebuke the offender, and then when they repent, you're to apologize. So there, rebuking becomes something that's part of a process of confronting something that's wrong in order to reconcile the community and to ensure forgiveness for somebody. So that's kind of interesting to remember. A rebuke is not simply a final word, I'm against you. It can be something that's a middle word on its way toward reconciliation. In chapter 18, the disciples rebuke people who are bringing their children to Jesus to be blessed. And Jesus tells them, don't do that. Let me have them. So the disciples are rebuking, but they shouldn't be. In chapter 19, when Jesus comes into Jerusalem, the story we'll read next week, some of the religious leaders tell Jesus, you should rebuke these folks who are celebrating you and calling you the coming one. And Jesus refuses to do it. So already we've seen 2 instances where rebuke should not be happening. So it's not always a righteous, good thing to do. And the last time this verb appears in Luke's gospel is in chapter 23. When Jesus is on the cross, and you'll remember he was hanging between 2 thieves, and one of them begins to join the crowd in cajoling Jesus, saying, why don't you rescue us if you're the Messiah? And the other rebukes that thief and says, don't you see what's happening? We're getting what we deserve, and this one has done no wrong. So, and that's the last use of rebuke. So it's kind of an interesting term. Sometimes it's translated rebuke, sometimes it's not. And it could mean something like you just charge somebody or order somebody something. So let's think about this for a minute. Jesus rebukes a fever. Think about what that's like. it's almost like Jesus personifies the fever into another person or an agent of some sort, rebukes the fever, and the fever leaves. Likewise, in the storm at sea, Jesus rebukes the wind, again, kind of personifying the wind as something other than simply the result of atmospheric pressure, and instead almost treating the wind as an entity in itself, as an agent, able to keep doing or stop doing what it's doing. So it's kind of interesting how this rebuking works. I would not normally think of a fever, and certainly not of a strong wind, as some other kind of agent that I can argue with, that I can rebuke, that I can command, as it were. But that's what Jesus does in that story. So in our story, Jesus rebukes a fever, and he rebukes demons. So when we think of Jesus rebuking demons, we normally think that there's some kind of spiritual warfare going on here, and you got Jesus, the good one, and demons, the evil one, and Jesus is showing who's boss. That may be the case, but I think we have reason to pause that way of thinking and just consider for a moment, but Jesus will also rebuke a fever, which I don't think is a bad agent, an evil entity like I would think a demon is. Jesus rebukes a wind. You know, wind is a necessary part of our atmosphere. Strong winds can certainly be very, very destructive, but strong winds can also be very creative and very helpful when it comes to renewing the earth. So it just happens to be that strong wind, while they're in a boat at sea, became very imperiling for them. So what does it mean to rebuke? If you can rebuke a demon, you can rebuke disciples, you can rebuke a fever, you can rebuke a wind. It just seems to be one of those verbs that can go in a lot of different directions. And one reason I want to hold it in all of its complexity is because I think we tend to reckon that when Jesus rebukes demons, he's doing it in the same way that he will later rebuke the disciples for what they do, or the same way that the disciples were rebuking parents for letting their children come up and climb all over Jesus. And maybe it's more akin to what Jesus is doing with these non-impersonal elements like fever and the wind. Maybe it's not so much a personalized thing like talking to people as much as it is an elemental thing, talking to the wind. You can think about talking to the wind, but we do so metaphorically rather than literally. And I just wonder if that's a more helpful way of imagining what it means when Jesus rebukes a demon. Instead of being some kind of spiritual warfare happening right there, maybe it's much more akin to speaking to those things that exist in the world, that have every right to exist in the world, and yet at times can be destructive, and at times need to be resisted, as it were. I just want you to hold that word rebuke in all of its complexity, and let's talk about that more on Wednesday. I'm a little worried that I'm talking in circles and maybe not making sense to you. But rebuking is one of the ways that Jesus goes about healing people. And with Simon's mother, Jesus rebukes the fever. Another way that Jesus goes about healing people is laying his hands on them. So you've got two different means by which Jesus does healing in Luke's gospel so far. I'm not pretending this is the exhaustive list, but at least so far we've seen two different means of Jesus healing people. There are some other instances in Luke's gospel where Jesus lays hands on others. Of course, he does it here for those who are brought to him. There's no telling how many. There is a moment in the 5th chapter where Jesus will lay his hands on a man with leprosy in the process of healing him. In the 8th chapter, Jesus will take the hand with his hand. He will take his hand, raise up the daughter of Jairus, who is either swooned or already dead when he raises her. And in the 13th chapter, Jesus will touch as he heals a woman who's been bent over double for 18 years. And he heals her on the Sabbath, which the fact that he touches her and physically engages there seems to be why suddenly he's charged with doing work on the Sabbath as opposed to observing rest on the Sabbath. So you've got all these several instances of Jesus touching people as a means of healing them, not simply rebuking the illness that besets them. There are other references to hands. You know, we heard one a few weeks ago when the devil quoted the psalm that said the angels will bear you on their hands so you don't dash your foot against a stone. We'll hear it later on the cross when Jesus says to God, into your hands I commend my spirit. So hands play a really interesting, nurturing, protective role. But you can also be betrayed into the hands of others. So it can be a really ambiguous thing about human life is what we do with our hands. But the thing I want you to think about is the danger involved here. If someone has a fever, especially a raging fever, you don't know if that's infectious. I mean, that could be why they asked Jesus about her. Do we touch her? Can we go in this room? Do we have to isolate her? In the other story, when Jesus touches a man with leprosy, I mean, he is technically unclean at that point. So just think about the danger, the vulnerability involved when touching those who are sick as a means of healing them. I always assumed that Jesus had this kind of impenetrable shell of godness around him to where he could touch someone with leprosy and not get leprosy. There is one story in Mark's gospel that immediately after touching a leper, Jesus goes out by himself in the wilderness. And I think that might be an indication that Jesus is actually ritually unclean and has to leave community for a short time in order to follow the days of ritual cleansing. So it speaks to the vulnerability of being a healer, especially when you don't know the degree of contagion involved in sickness. But laying hands is the second form of healing people that we see in our story. And then you've got the curious thing that the demons know that Jesus is the Christ. That's a conversation that's rather odd, isn't it? The Greek word that's translated that they knew Jesus was the Christ, it's actually in the pluperfect form. So it should say not that we know you are the Christ, but we had known that you were the Christ. It's weird. That's a verb that often appears either in the perfect or the pluperfect tense, and I don't know why. But I have noticed it is a habit. It's a verb that means literally to see, but in Greek as well as in English, sometimes when you say, oh, I see, you don't really mean you're visualizing something as much as you're comprehending something. So it's got a couple of different meanings to the term, and but it often appears again in either the perfect or the pluperfect tense, and that doesn't really fit into an English translation of how it should be interpreted. And most English translations will not show it in the perfect or pluperfect tense. They'll put it in either the present or the past tense, depending on what the sentence reads like otherwise. So that's just kind of a unique verb, but it is one that means to see, but literally to see, but also has that connotation of understanding. They know something, or they have known something, or they had known something, depending on how you want to interpret that verb. And what they know is that Jesus is the Son of God. They know that he's the Messiah, and they claim him to be that. So the question is, how do demons know this? You know, is there a spiritual realm where Jesus was prior to incarnation, and Jesus and the demons knew each other very well from that, and here Jesus is having become incarnate, and here demons are doing their dastardly deeds of afflicting human life, and when Jesus speaks to them, they're like, we know who you are, you know, that kind of a thing. I don't know what this signifies, that demons know who Jesus is. I do want to suggest one thing, though. What if it's not evil demon, you know, evil spirits running around, floating in and out of people and so forth, that know Jesus, but a context of suffering that knows who Jesus is? What if when someone is afflicted by a demon, what if that affliction, what if suffering is a place where the identity of Jesus is fully known? Just bear that in mind. What if suffering is a place where the identity of Jesus is fully known? Think about the implications that has as we read the book, Jesus and the Disinherited, right? Where Howard Thurman talks to us about people with their backs against the wall, and the things that they know better than the others, simply by virtue of having lived their life with their backs against the wall. There is a kind of knowing that comes through suffering, and it may be a kind of knowing that we're seeing here, that people who are afflicted with demons, the suffering itself has insight to who Jesus is. Not that it's good, bad, or indifferent. That may not be the point here, as much as just that suffering itself is a point of enlightenment. And particularly this kind of systemic, ongoing, and by systemic I mean fully systematized suffering, may be a way of recognizing who Christ is. I don't know, it's really interesting. The demons come out and they shout. We've seen this verb in other text studies that we've had. I think it's an onomatopoeia for the sound that a raven makes, because it's literally something like cracko. It almost sounds like croaking. And it's usually a sign of distress. So when the demons come out professing Jesus as the Son of God, this is not a compliment. It's almost a complaint, as it were, a cry of remonstrance of some sort. And they say that Jesus is the Son of God. And Luke, the narrator, says they had known that he was the Messiah. So what you have there is the Son of God, that phrase, and the word Messiah or Christ, same word, as being kind of appositional phrases, perhaps, meaning the very same thing, Son of God and the Christ. That seems to be what's implied in this story. I'm not sure that in every instance one sees the word Christ, Messiah, that the implication there is Son of God. That gives us cause to kind of rethink what we think of both of those terms. Not simply in convinced Christian terms, it's all the same thing, but trying to remember that this is a period where this language is being developed, as it were, and filled with meaning vis-a-vis the life of Jesus. So it's interesting that the demons say Son of God. The narrator interprets that as Messiah. And then Jesus silences the demons. Whoa, that's an interesting thing there. Jesus also will silence the disciples when they tell him that he is the Messiah, and that raises the question of whether there's some kind of Messianic secret going on here. That's a phrase that I don't have time to describe and fully explore now, but we will certainly pick that up on Wednesday and look at the history and meaning of that term. But I do wonder that when the demons come out croaking that Jesus is the Son of God, then Jesus silences them if it's too late. I mean, the word's already out there. But that doesn't seem to be the concern of Luke. The concern of Luke is that they know who Jesus is and that Jesus silences them. So that's why we want to talk about this phrase, Messianic Secret, or just this very act of Jesus silencing these demons and what that signifies. Because the question is, what's going on here? Demons naming Jesus, Jesus silencing demons. That's going to be the beginning focus of our study on Wednesday once we entertain some of your questions from the text and this video. All right? So thank you so much for being here, and I look forward to seeing as many of you as I can on Wednesday, and blessings to you and your studies.